Yeah, I believe you're muted still if you're talking.
Yes. Okay. I'm no longer muted. So yeah, a quick little primer on machine learning. Um, this guy is the Terminator, and a lot of people think of like stuff like the Terminator when they think of AI these days, and they're like, "Ooh, AI." What they're generally thinking about is something called general AI. There are two types of AI. There's general AI and narrow AI. General AI is stuff like the Terminator and stuff that is really really powerful and people are afraid are gonna like take over the world and take over jobs and everything. But as of today, general AI is very very far off. It is the stuff of fiction. And as we learned from the AttnGAN demo that we just did, and what we do have today is narrow AI, which is code that does one really, really, really specific thing really well, or hopefully really well. So an example of this is this model called CycleGAN. And the task that CycleGAN does is it takes images of horses and then translates them to images of zebras and vice versa. And that's like literally like all it does. Like yeah, it turns horses to zebras, zebras to horses. If you give it a picture of a person, who knows what'll happen because it wasn't trained for that very, very specific task. And that's sort of like the thing we want to highlight is that machine learning today is super, super, super specific. And yeah, it'll only perform well for that very narrow task. Yeah, so just sort of like setting expectations that like ML is like, not at Terminator level yet. Um, and so the general pipeline for, creating something with machine learning is there are three main components. There's your data set, which is usually like a lot of images in the case of our class. There's training, which is when you take your big data set and then put it through a network and then you know, let it bake for a couple hours or a couple days. And then coming out of that, you have like a trained model. And then the third thing you can do once you have your trained model is something called testing, also known as inference, where you take your model that you've baked for a little while and you actually use it to make new images. So yeah, going through each of those steps a little more in detail. Data sets. Right now, when we think of data, we might think of like I don't know, addresses I've lived in before, or like your own personal data. We can also think of data in terms of like collections of people's data, like on the Facebook level, like they have billions of people's data, you know, all compiled. For this class, what we're going to talk about when we talk about data sets are big stacks of images, usually like 500 to 1,000 images that we're collecting. Like Stephen said, he has like a lot of scans of one particular thing, and that is like what we want for this class and what will be useful for training your models. The second component, training. Training is when you have like your big stack of images, and then you put it through a neural network, which will have a particular architecture. Um, they're usually they usually are represented by like these neural network diagrams that you've probably seen. Um, and then outcomes after you've trained it for a couple hours to a day on like a beefy GPU, we can think of it as a black box. And within that black box, it has the structure of this neural network, but it contains, or ideally will contain the like an idea of what your data set is. So this black box, like sort of should encapsulate what your training data looks like. And for more on training and like the actual like math of how training works, I would encourage like if you guys are interested in that to watch this movie or this video. It's from Three Blue One Brown, which does a really really great job about explaining the math and sort of like the nitty gritty details of like how it all works under the hood. And then the third part, testing, that's when you have like your nice little black box all baked and you're taking new images or a new input, and then telling it, hey, run through this thing that I've already let train for a while, and then use that to generate new images. So in the case of the cycle GAN, that was when, they already had this model that was supposed to turn horses to zebras or zebras to horses. And the testing portion of that would be like, okay, I'm going to input a picture of a horse here on the left, and then the thing it spits out is a picture of a zebra. Yeah, and that was about it for our very quick machine learning primer. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to
So
unmute and ask.
I think maybe one of the things that I would want to mention too is, so we looked at the AttnGAN model, right? Which, as we saw it, was you give it a piece of text and you generate an image from it. That's that testing inference section. The way the model was actually trained is they had a bunch of images, and they probably assigned writing captions to some poor data science intern. Like they probably had something like 10,000 images, and they made someone or something write captions for each one of those. And then what they did is they trained the model on both the images and the captions, with the intention that the output of the model be able to generate images from text. So this is something you'll see pretty commonly, is you almost like reverse engineer what you want your like output to finally be. You sort of almost build the opposite in terms of the data set. So we'll look at this a lot more when we go into other models. But just remember that in some cases, or like horses, zebras are a really great example too. Like what they did is they created a folder of horses and a folder of zebras, and the model, the network was trained to sort of determine how to translate between those two. So we'll look at a lot more examples. That was a really quick overview, but we'll look at a lot more examples to sort of reinforce that behavior, and we'll keep coming back to this. So if it was like a little fuzzy today, I promise that over the next couple weeks we'll like keep building on that and add up to it. Yeah, if there are any questions, like please feel free to ask. Okay, silence. Okay, I take that as like either a yes, I hit it, I got it, or it's starting to get late and I'm like already burnt out. Either of those is fine. I totally understand. Let's talk a little bit about Runway. Oops, sorry if you didn't want to see the weird Vladimir Putin. I warned you. It's definitely weird. There's lots of weird things you can do with horse to zebra. So let's talk a little bit about Runway. I know we're getting close to time, so I am recording this. So if you do need to drop off at 9, or if it's getting late, I don't know what time it is for Amander, but if you do need to drop off, like please feel free. The homework assignment section, maybe let's talk about the homework assignment before I dive into Runway. The homework for you is just going to be to play with Runway. So I'll talk a little about what Runway is, and I'll do a quick demo, and hopefully we can get out of here by like 9:10, 9:15. But basically, I just want you to play around in the Runway interface, find some models to play with, explore a couple ideas. We've got some links to tutorials if you are sort of stuck and just want someone to follow along. But yeah, the homework will basically be just to play with Runway this week. So I'm just gonna see, we've got someone in the chat here.
Oh, and also watch the Colab video.
Yes, and there's a Colab video. So the homework actually, man, first week, really getting messy, but I'll clean this up for second week. At the very end of the slides of the homework, we'll also put those into the class site. But essentially, there's the homework for using the Runway, using Runway, and then there is also this video we want folks to watch. So one of the things to know about this class is like, because we only have an hour and a half, we're going to try to make, besides this class, classes going forward will be a little bit more discussion based. We might do some demos, but we're going to try to lean a little bit more in discussion. So what we'll do is every week, basically the week before, we'll ask you to watch a video that sort of covers some of the material. And then we can come in the next week and we can sort of like talk about, what was in there, what questions do you have? Lee and I can run through some demos about sort of like, okay, now that you've learned a little bit about what this is, like, let's actually use it, like, let's play with it. So for next week, I want you to watch this video. It's about 30 minutes. Some of you I know already have used Colab in previous classes. If you haven't, this will just help explain how Colab works. Colab is a similar tool to Runway. So talking about Colab now when we really just wanted to talk about Runway. But yeah, if you need to duck out, just know the homework is listed here. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Runway. So Runway is a tool. I mentioned it was its founders were former ITP students. It was basically their thesis project that they then turned into a company. So Runway is sound like a small team of about 10 people. They're based out of Brooklyn, so they're still all here. And it's a great little tool to basically help you use all of these open source machine learning models. So most machine learning models are made at science labs, data science labs, so places like Facebook, Adobe, Google. There's a couple other like sort of machine learning specific companies that are getting really big, and a lot of these are research, labs where they try to determine how to make a model, and they make a model and they release the code, and they just sort of like drop it one time on GitHub and then never come back to it. And there's cool stuff there, and but most people don't get to play with it. So Runway's job was basically to take a lot of these models and bring it into an interface that they felt was easier to use. So it's always great to start with Runway in a class like this because it is I want to say it's intuitive. I mean, it's like any interface. It takes a little bit of time, but it's a lot easier because there is a GUI to it. So a lot of people have described Runway as like a Photoshop for machine learning. I don't think it's that easy, or I don't think it's that specific, but it definitely is. Because of the GUI, it makes it a little bit easier to use. So, again, this class doesn't require any coding. Even when we do the Colab stuff, which we'll talk about more next week, you don't need to use it. You don't need to know any code for this. I do personally find that Runway removes a lot of hurdles. We'll start to see a little bit of those when we hit Colab, but if you tried to do machine learning 3 or 4 years ago before Runway existed, it was a nightmare to get things installed and get them set up. And Runway has sort of eliminated a lot of that. So what's nice is you saw with AttnGAN, I was able to get a model up and running and play with it in about a minute or two. So it's a really nice usage. Runway has, over the past year or two, also added interfaces to improve functionality. So when we start talking about StyleGAN and other models that use vector inputs, we'll see that they've built a bunch of interfaces to allow you to explore latent spaces, which we'll talk about next week in more detail, but also to generate animations and other things. So they built up sort of a suite of tools that are going to become pretty powerful, especially over the next couple months or next couple years. They're also really moving into being able to do video production and that sort of thing. So there's a really cool rotoscoping tool that they just added that uses machine learning. So if you are a rotoscoper or ever struggled doing rotoscoping, they have a new tool that's actually pretty great. So as Leah mentioned, like machine learning can be broken down into sort of 3 pieces: data sets, training, and testing. Runway really focuses mostly on the testing part, which means they're using what are called pre-built models, meaning someone has already generated a model like horse to zebra, or the text to image model, and you get to play with those pre-built models. There is a little bit of training functionality built into Runway. You could train your own model. We'll probably look at that in the next couple of weeks, but it's pretty limited in what you can train. I think there's like 3 or 4 models they allow you to train, whereas with Colab, we'll be able to train pretty much any model we want. And lastly, they have some data set manipulation tools, but they're pretty small. When we talk about data sets, which I believe we'll do in the 4th or 5th week of class, we'll basically be using some tools that I've built, and those will do command line stuff, so it might be a little bit, it'll be kind of code, but not really. We'll walk you through that if you're a little uncomfortable using the command line. But Runway doesn't have a whole lot of data set tools, and that's sort of a problem, or like one of the hindrances to what Runway is. So yeah, it's mostly pre-trained models. You will find that not every model that you have heard about exists in Runway. There could be many reasons for that. Sometimes the interface doesn't support the type of model you're looking for. So Runway doesn't support audio or video, audio inputs or video inputs. It does support doing video out. We'll talk about that maybe in one of our demos. But it's pretty limited in terms of what it can support. So if there's a brand new model you just heard or just saw someone using, it might not be in Runway today. It might be there in a couple months. It might not be. Who knows? Pretty limited training, as I mentioned. And I will say Runway is fairly expensive. So let's talk about the costs. So Runway costs 5 cents per minute when you're doing testing. In most cases, you won't really need to use it for more than 5 or 10 minutes at a time. So that comes out to 25 cents or 50 cents, depending on how long you're training, or sorry, how long you're using it for. So that adds up over time, right? You probably don't want to be spending hours in this thing, as it will build up over time. Training, which we'll talk about in more detail when we get to our training sessions, which will be in a couple weeks. Training costs ½ cent per step. Most steps or most trainings go for about 3,000 to 6,000 steps. So ends up being what, $15 to $30 per training. Compare that to Colab Pro, which is $10 a month, and you can train as long as you want for that whole month. Colab will feel very quickly much more cheaper and much more efficient. But with the downside of like you don't have as cool of GUIs or interfaces to sort of hide some of the annoying parts of machine learning. So just be aware of that. Training also does require one of their subscription plans. I believe for this class, I'm going to get everyone a free training session through Chris. So I've got everyone's email addresses, so I'll make sure that you all get set up with a free training session. But outside of that, you would have to pay for it. So we'll get to explore and experiment with it. In general, if you're in a part of this class, I'm going to recommend we use Colab for training. But if you want to, you're more than welcome to use Runway as well. Okay, so I'm just going to open up Runway, and I'm going to walk through sort of how I explore and how I would use it. I think some of this was included in the video that Leah shared previously, but I'll just walk through it again. And feel free to just stop me and ask questions if you have any. I just want to quickly go through the interface, how it works, and then if there are, we'll do a quick demo of one of the models or two of the models that are in there. So Runway used to exist in a desktop app. They've sort of stopped. They've moved away from that. So now it should be, if you just go to app.runwayml.com, there's a web interface. And the desktop interface and the web interface are pretty much the exact same these days. So when you first come to the homepage, there's lots of sort of tools available at the very top here. They've sort of pushed or prioritized certain tools. So I mentioned their rotoscoping tool. This is the big thing they're starting to use. We probably won't look at that much in this class, but if you want to play with it, you're more than welcome to. What we're really going to look at are the models, the model interface. So there's a button here that says Browse Models, but there's also a section over here in the sidebar that says Models. So if you click on the models, you'll see each of these is broken down into a category. What I really recommend is for the next week, like just dig around in some of these categories and see what exists. So each one of these, when you click into them, will have a little, they'll sort of have a little description of how each one of these works. Bring old photos back to life. Robust depth estimation for images and videos, real-time high-resolution background matting. So you might not know what these mean, or maybe you do. Like, you might understand what background matting is or what depth estimation is. But what I recommend is just dig around within each category and find a model that you want to play with. So there's a couple things you can do here. So when you hover over one of these cards, there's a button here that says Learn More. I definitely recommend checking out the Learn More, just because it's usually a better description of how it works. So go ahead and click Learn More. And once you're in here, there's usually a little bit of a description or a gallery of how it works. So quite often the language for these is kind of funky because it's written in the way that these scientific papers are written. So we propose to restore old photos that suffer from severe degradation. All it does is it cleans up all the noise or scratches or other things from an image, right? So you will find that there's a little bit of a funny language barrier here of it's written in a very scientific language. And what it really means, it does this, right? And that's sort of the challenge with some of this stuff is because these are all open source models, no one's gone through and actually written them for a normal human. So it's a little bit of us trying to figure out what each of these things does. So if you find a model you like, the next step is to add it to your workspaces. So imagine that models are all the models that are available to you, and a workspace is like your easel, or where you're going to move a model into to start working with it. So there's two ways to add it to your workspace. The first is up here in the corner. You can add your model to a workspace. The other is if you're back on the cards, when you hover over one of these cards, you'll see Add to Workspace. And it's kind of up to you what you want to do. I'm going to find one here that isn't, so this is what post-processing. So I'm actually just going to find one that's a little bit more generative and have some fun making something. So let's look at, let's actually look at stylization. So each of these categories has something different that they do. And it's sort of important to kind of figure out what the inputs and outputs are, right? So what Leah mentioned is that your input determines your output. And that's really the core fundamental thing to learn about Runway, is to figure out what is your input and what is your output. So in the case of AttnGAN, the input was a piece of text and the output was an image. And some of these other models, it may be one image in, or it may be multiple images in. And we'll have to sort of figure out how to work with that. That is sort of one of the bigger challenges of this interface, is just sort of trying to figure out what the model is supposed to do and then actually getting it to do what you want it to do. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to add, this is a model called MUNIT. It's called Faces to Flowers. This actually happens to be one of my models. I added it to Runway a couple months ago. If we go ahead and click Learn More, we can sort of figure out what it's about. So MUNIT is a multimodal version of an unpaired image translation network. So I also failed at making this sound human. What does this do? This actually just, it translates images. So it's like horses to zebras, except this model was meant to convert faces to flowers. What's nice about this is that we'll look at this in a minute, but there's actually a way to have a slider that changes the various style outputs. So we'll look at this. So we'll go ahead and add this to our workspace. I should also mention that if you are really interested in, like, if you've read data science papers before or you like to see code, for many of these things, there are links here to the paper. There's links to GitHub repos. There's lots of links in here to play with. So if you want to explore, go for that. I'm just going to go ahead and add this to my workspace. I'm going to add it to a new workspace. And it always gives you a funny name for your first workspace. But you can go ahead and change that. So I'm going to change this to MUNIT Demo. Hit Create. So now we're in our workspace interface. The key thing to remember here is that until you hit run on a model, you're not being charged 5 cents a minute. So up until this point, I haven't been charged any money. But down here in the corner is this button that says Run Model. As soon as I click that, it's going to start charging me for my time. So once I hit run, you'll see it's going to start up. What's happening is behind the scenes, the server is being spun up. It's installing all the software I need to run this. It usually takes a minute or two, sometimes a little bit longer, depending on the model. But it's basically running behind the scenes. And at this point, we're like somewhere between now and when the model actually starts, I'm going to start being charged for my time. So I believe when you first set up Runway, you get $15 in credits, which will definitely get you pretty far. I would say for this class, if you're not going to do training in Runway, you probably need $15, $30 of credits total, because it doesn't really take, doesn't take that much time. Yeah, thank you, Leah. So there's a way to check your balance as well. All right, so this is still getting spun up here. It does take a little bit of time for some of these models. What I usually find is if a model hasn't been used in a while, it takes a little bit longer for it to get spun up because it's not in their cache system or whatever it is. So this can just take a minute here. So while this happens, I'm going to try to find, I'm going to find some faces to play with. So I don't know why, but I've been in like a Luther Vandross meal, been really digging some of his stuff. So I'm just going to grab some of his faces. So because this is a demo, also we should talk about, rights and usage, and Leah will cover more of that in a couple weeks. But because this is a fun demo, we can just sort of work with whatever images we find on the internet. Let's see if this saves down. And then my second favorite person to play with photos of is Rihanna. Come on. I don't know, for whatever reason, photos of these folks always work better than other ones do. Let's just pop this one. Oh, what a terrible headline for me to be clicking on. Let's not do that. So I've got two images here. So let's see if this is up and running. So it is now. So you'll see here down here at the bottom right, it says stop. That basically means my model is running and I can start to play with this. So the next thing I need to do is I need to figure out what my inputs are. So you'll see here there's an input section here. And if I click on this, I get the option of a camera or my file. So obviously if I switch to camera, it's going to take my face and it's going to try to generate images off of my face. That works fine. It's a pretty slow frame rate, so I think it's something like a couple frames per second. So just be aware of that. I'm going to switch to file just because I tend to like to have control over my images a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab. Oh, so this opens up your image interface. I have a ton of images that I previously have used. I'm going to upload another file. Most of you will probably have nothing in your in your repository of images. So you're just going to want to upload an image. So let's see where Luther went off to. Downloads. Nope, don't know where Luther went off to. Demodified. There we go. Okay, so here's Luther. So we'll open this one. This is going to upload your image to their service, and then you'll see this starts to spin, right? So there's a little blue line here that ran as it tried to generate images. So here we have Luther kind of as flowers, right? So the other thing about this model is that it's a little funky, right? Like every time I upload a different image, some of them work really well, some of them don't work well at all. And I have to kind of find out why that is or what's going on. So what's cool about this model in particular is that there is this style inference option. And if I slide this and change it, it'll generate a different type of image for me. So this is a different, flower image. I can type in a number here. These numbers don't really correspond to anything. It's sort of a random seed if you're used to using that in like processing or something. So I can type in like 101 or 10 or 101. So you'll see that each of these has a slightly different texture and different color to it. And so some of these models will have multiple different, some of these networks will have multiple different models in here, and they'll be you'll be able to choose them from over here. So you'll see this one is already FFQ to ladies. We'll talk about what FFHQ is later, but essentially you can choose a different model. So let's actually try this with different. So also see the resolution. It does match 1-to-1. Other models will shrink your images down. It's just kind of model dependent, which is a little annoying to figure out, but you'll sort of see that you've got some options here. So if I want to save this image, down here in the right-hand corner is this little download button. This lets save image. If you hit this, it's just going to download the image directly to your desktop. So I can also switch and change out my image. So let's switch it to that Rihanna image. So, I tend to find that this model doesn't work as well as I would have expected it to in Runway, which is funny because I built it and trained it, and I knew it worked well on faces of images. So for example, I can sort of show you what this does look like in the way that I trained it, which is, I think there's a couple of reasons for this, and we can talk about like, one of the challenges with machine learning is that, again, it's such a narrow set of data and the way it's used, that I believe that one of the issues with this particular model is that it's meant to work with like a certain resolution of images. And if you select resolution of images, it tends not to work as well. So here, let me show you some examples of how it does work well. I think my internet's getting a little slow here. Sorry about that. Yeah, so while this loads, maybe ask, this is a good question. If you do stuff for this class, if you want to tag me or Leah, we can send you our Instagram handles. It's totally up to you, whatever you want to do. We certainly appreciate when people tag us because then we can share it as well. But it's definitely up to you if you want to. Yeah, so just tagging me or Leah in your Instagram account is great. So these are some examples of what this model can do. The challenge is, I think, is just like finding the exact right resolution that it's meant to be. So it usually wants to be high resolution. And the photos, good quality photos in equals good quality photos out. But you can see here that you can generate lots of different types of things. It does work with cats, surprisingly enough. Somehow all my models always work with cats. That's like a personal preference or thing I have to do. But so like, it's kind of, this is one of the challenges is you might see a really, really good image as a demo, and then you try to play with the model yourself and you're like, why doesn't this thing work the way I want it to? And one of the challenges is just like trying to figure out like, okay, what is this model trying to do? Do I have to find the perfect type of photo? Does it have to be lit a certain way? Like what's sort of going on here? And you will, as I mentioned, like lower your expectations. For this week, you will probably end up being frustrated. And that's okay, or like it sucks that you're frustrated in the first week of class. But I would say is like part of what we're going to learn over the next 10 weeks is how to better optimize our inputs and outputs to produce better images over time. Or to train our own models so that we can have more control over these things. So as you go through these models, like you might find like I have no idea what this input does, or like I don't know what a vector is. Some of you in this class know what vectors are because we've talked about them before in other classes. But you might come across an interface that has some vector input, and you're like, what's going on here? And I would recommend like we're sort of throwing you in the deep end for this class, but like I recommend Googling stuff. I recommend asking questions in our Slack channel. The whole point of this is like this week we're going to throw you in the deep end. Next week we're going to throw you in the deep end for Colab. But the hope is that you begin to get a little bit more comfortable in sort of figuring things out yourself or asking questions after a little bit of Googling yourself. So, don't feel too overwhelmed by this. My suggestion would be to find 3 or 4 models in Runway to play with, hopefully models of different categories. So when you go back to that model interface, and you've got these categories, I would recommend trying a couple different categories. Stylization tends to have a lot of things called style transfer, and there are like 10 different style transfer models, and each of them works slightly differently. Some are really good and some are really bad, and like it's kind of a challenge to figure out what's what. So the whole point of this week is definitely to like come back next week with more questions. And Leah and I, like it's our job to sort of help walk you through answers to those. But hopefully you'll also learn a little bit by just sort of being like, what is this thing? How does this thing work? Okay, what do I think this thing could be? And if you're feeling game up to it, like definitely try to check out the papers. We'll see the papers are very heavily science focused. There's a lot of math in them. My recommendation is to like gloss your eyes over the math and look at the pictures in them, because the pictures can tell you a lot about how the model works and those sort of things. I should also mention that there is, in our slide deck, there is a link here at the very end to a number of demos that Leah and I have recorded. So if you do get stuck and you're like, I can't figure out anything that's going on in this thing, go ahead and check out this link. We have, I think there's something like 10 or 15 demos of different runway models that Leah and I have recorded, and we'll sort of walk you through different parts of it. So if you do feel stuck, I've actually recorded a video on how my flowers to faces model works. I know Leah has done a couple other examples of various things. So feel free to walk through this and try things out and see what's what. So if you do get stuck, you can always resort to this. But in general, I would say start by just playing and trying things out yourself. Any questions before we call it a night?
I have like a super boring technical question.
Please.
Does this kind of stuff, is there like a preference for Mac or PC with any of this kind of stuff? Like if I have both, should I choose one?
Yeah, so for this class, everything we're going to do is going to run on the web. So as long as you have access to web, you can totally, it should work just fine for you. Yeah.
Cool.
So maybe you had a question in the chat. Every time you change the number, does the model rerun and add to the time balance that they charge? Yes, so that is true. So basically, if your button at the bottom says stop or like is running, no matter until you hit stop on that model, you're being charged. So even if you're not generating images, you're being charged for that time. There is a good auto shut off feature. I think it auto shuts off after 3 or 5 minutes of inactivity. So if nothing's happening, it won't like charge you. It actually used to not exist. When I first started using Runway, I once shut my laptop and lost like $50 because there was no auto shut off feature. Thankfully, they fixed that. So like you don't have to worry about that. Your machine will, if you don't use it, it will auto shut off after 3 or 5 minutes, which can sometimes lead to having to restart it all the time. But just be aware of that. So yeah, as once you press that run button, you're essentially being charged until it stops.
So like if you're trying to futz around with stuff and you futz with the numbers for a bunch, and then you stop and go do something else, you should hit the stop button before you like go get tea or whatever. Okay.
Yeah, definitely you should do that. Like I said, there's an auto shut off feature where it will just shut off itself after a couple minutes. But yeah, it's probably good to be in the practice of just shutting off the machine if you walk away from it. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Hey, Derek, what makes for good data sets? What makes for bad data sets?
Great question. We will talk about that in week 3 or 4.
Let's hope.
So yeah, so delayed gratification there, but we will definitely talk about data sets. So one thing to think about is as you're playing with these, obviously you're playing with someone else's data sets, and like that can be like, oh, this isn't really that exciting. Like, okay, another horse to zebra. Like, do I really need to see more horses and more zebras? You can start to think about like, what would you apply to it? So if it's not horse to zebras, is it like, I don't know, sea lions to something else, or like, in the case of face to flowers, would it be faces to cat faces? Like, start to think about how you might actually want to change the way this thing works. And that'll be like a good segue into, I think my personal experience with folks using these tools is that after about 2 or 3 weeks of Runway, you're kind of bored of it. You're just like, okay, cool, I get it. Colab is a little bit more because you've got a little bit more expression. You can start to do training yourself. But yeah, I think by about week 3 or 4 of this class, you'll be like, I'm sick of pre-built models. Can I make my own thing? And that's when we'll start to jump into making your own data sets and training. So we'll get there, I promise. First 2 weeks are just like us like learning these tools and learning how to use them, and then we'll jump into sort of customizing them for ourselves.
Sounds good.
Cool.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So just like just like images, it's also possible to train 3D mesh data also, right? Is it?
So there are some 3D models. Those are really, I find them pretty cumbersome to use. And I've yet to see one that really does a good job yet, but there are some. The challenge is, of course, also getting 3D training data, because a lot of that is tied up into, proprietary data sets or things owned by other people. So if you're interested, I can dig around and see what's what. I haven't looked at 3D models in probably a year or two. There might be some better stuff out there. But in this class, we'll definitely focus mostly on images, just because the training data is a little bit easier to source.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so as a reminder, homework for this week is to play in Runway, and then there is a video at the end of the slides that we'll link to in the class notes as well, about Colab. So watch that. It just tries to explain how Colab differs from other more like code-based tools. So I think it'll be a good introduction, and the idea is like we'll do a demo of Colab next week, but hopefully you understand a little bit more about how it works. So the first 2 weeks are just us learning how to use Runway, and then yes, that is a great question. I will drop it in the Slack as well. So Ibrahim asked if we're going to do office hours. We will definitely have office hours. I think Leah and I need to figure out exactly when that will happen, but we'll probably try to do at least one before now and the next class. And then usually what we do is every week there's sort of 2 different hours for office hours. So 1 hour will be run by Leah, 1 hour will be run by me. And what we'll do is we'll basically announce them each week, and we'll basically ask for people to emoji react or respond if they're going to attend. That way, if like no one wants to attend, like we can go and do things and not wait around. And if you're like, oh, hey, I can attend, but I'm only going to attend at the last 15 minutes, that way we can just sort of schedule our time. So we'll announce them every week, and we might even move them around a little bit just to see if it can meet everyone's schedules or that sort of thing. But we'll start with a pretty consistent schedule, just sort of see what happens. And I guess we should also like talk about like the end goal for this whole class. Yeah, so Aminder, we'll definitely make sure that some that work for UK, and I think Rebecca's in Australia. So we'll make sure we've got some times that work for people outside of the US for sure. So basically, the idea for by the end of this class is that you'll have at least a project that you'll have made yourself, and we'll talk about what those projects could be and that sort of thing. So we'll also be like you'll also be able to schedule some time with Leah and I to like actually work on your project. So office hours are good for that. You can also schedule time one-on-one with us if you have additional questions. So the idea is like by the end of this class, you'll have made your own model and be able to build it and train it and run your own testing and inference on it. Maybe during videos, maybe doing other things with it. So we're just starting. It's obviously a 10-week class, so we're just getting our feet wet a little bit now. But know that like those office hours are meant for you to get help, both in the homeworks every week, but also in like building your own projects. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, we will see everyone next week. Oh, and I shall say, like, please feel free to use the Slack. If you have additional questions, just drop them in Slack, and we'll cover them all there as well.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Good one.
Bye.